We need to get back to, as people of the Christian faith, this understanding that the community is the center, not the individual.
I'm Mitch.
And I'm Missy.
We're co-workers.
He's the boss, and we're married.
And she's the boss. Together, we host Good Faith Weekly, a podcast on faith and culture.
What could possibly go wrong?
Tune in and find out. Missy. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up. We're going to talk about the latest news on the debt ceiling, and we're going to celebrate Pride Month. And then later on, we sat down with Andy Watts. Andy is a professor of religion at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. And he wrote an article sometime back about the debate regarding the debt ceiling. And it is germane today as it was years ago. So stay tuned. It's going to be a good pod. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. Happy Pride Month.
Well, happy Pride Month to you, too.
Thank you so much. How are you going to celebrate?
Well, we here at Good Faith Weekly are celebrating the start of Pride Month, as all people should, by talking about the debt ceiling.
Nothing more festive than a great debate on the debt ceiling, right?
Right. So today's conversation is with Andy Watts, and we're talking to him. We're referencing an article he wrote a while back about the debt ceiling.
You know, I want to interject real quick because that article was during the Obama administration, and I kind of got all the warm and fuzzies when I read it.
Did you? That's funny. That's really funny. So as any episode goes where we talk about anything involving civics, what do I like to do?
Give me a quiz.
Yes.
I have not studied.
I'm going to let the listeners in on some behind the scenes action. So whenever we have a quiz, here is how my preparation begins. I Google whatever the topic is, fun facts. You may all be surprised to learn that when you Google debt ceiling fun facts, there are exactly zero.
Google says, are you kidding me?
So we're going to start with a quick debt ceiling quiz, and then we're going to pivot to something more fun.
Okay.
So I discovered that through Google that the debt ceiling is a restriction on how much the federal government can borrow to pay its bills and allocate funds for future investments.
Okay.
Sounds riveting, right?
Very.
Okay, so tell us, Mitch, when was the debt ceiling created?
Oh, I read this just the other day. Was it during the Reagan administration, the 80s?
Reagan? No. The debt ceiling was created by a 1917 federal law meant to help fund World War I without creating too much debt.
Oh, there you go.
There was another website that kind of said the 60s, but anyways, we're going to go with this one that says 1917 because I found that on a few different sources. So how many times has Congress raised the debt ceiling?
Oh my gosh. I would imagine 60.
102 times since World War II.
Since World War II? Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay.
Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy.
What happens if the debt ceiling isn't raised?
We default on our bills.
But what happens?
Nobody really knows.
All calamity ensues. So I'm going to take
Fun
this.
fact.
It says, if the Congress doesn't raise the debt ceiling by the certain date, the federal government will default on some of its obligations, something that has never happened before. Experts say the ramifications of a debt default could be far-reaching and dire. And this is where I think we're going to be okay. Because they say, think, a recession, major losses in the stock market, and potential disruptions to Social Security payments. This is what I think we have security, is that Those Congress folks know their constituents.
Yes, they do. They do. Yeah.
If they're not getting their Social Security payments.
And again, this is a boomer problem. So
Right. So it will be solved.
It will be solved.
If everybody has hung in there thus far for our very non-fun fact quiz. So now we're going to pivot to something much more fun.
Okay.
Which is Pride Month, as we mentioned at the top of the
so
show.
excited about
So
Pride
I
Month.
decided it would be way more fun to have a quiz about Pride Month.
Okay.
Don't you agree?
I agree totally
Okay.
because I knew nothing about the debt ceiling.
Okay. So why is June Pride Month?
Because it is the anniversary of Stonewall.
Right. June is the month in which the Stonewall riots of 1969 are commemorated. The Stonewall Inn, a well-known gay club in New York, Greenwich Village, was raided by the New York City police on June 28, 1969. This provoked a wave of protests and violent conflicts in local bars and neighborhoods, serving as a catalyst for the global gay rights movement. However, I love this story. I may be the only one who didn't know this. The Stonewall riots were not America's first LGBTQ uprising,
Right.
which is not surprising. But this one I love. In May of 1959, a group of LGBTQ individuals who were fed up with being mistreated by police fought back at Cooper Donuts in Los Angeles.
Well, as one would.
They, according to the website Out, the group, which was led by several transgender women, quote, pelted officers with donuts, coffee, and paper plates until they were forced to retreat and return with larger numbers.
Oh, wow.
It is-
That's been like bricks.
It is believed to be the first documented LGBTQ uprising in U.S. history, but I love the imagery
Oh, the
of the
imagery's great.
coffee, the donuts, and paper plates.
And paper plates. That's awesome. Hey, you mentioned Stonewall, and our media producer, Cliff Vaughn, whom we all love and adore, he and I were actually in New York City in 2019 to celebrate not only Pride Month, but the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. It was really cool. We went down to Stonewall, and I mean, there are thousands and thousands of people. We may have hung out with, Lady Gaga as well.
Sure you did. I bet. From a very safe distance.
But it was
right?
really cool. It really was really cool.
So where and when was the first Pride Parade held?
Oh, I would say either New York City or San Francisco.
Okay, most people feel like it's New York, but actually it's Chicago.
Oh, okay.
So while the Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day March in New York City is widely considered to be the first Pride Parade, it actually occurred one day after Chicago held its first march, which technically makes Chicago the birthplace of Pride.
Very cool.
And did you know, I like this fun fact too, as someone from the South, not all Pride parades and LGBTQ celebrations are held in June. Do you know
Really?
why?
No, I do not know why.
Because it's dadgum hot here in June.
Yeah, that is true.
So many celebrations take place in the fall because that makes sense. And we need to turn to our LGBTQIA plus individuals for advice on such things because they've got it right.
That's exactly right.
So certain Atlanta Pride, Orlando Pride, Kentuckiana Pride, and Louisville occur closer to National Coming Out Day in October. So I support this decision. Do you know who is considered the mother of Pride?
Oh my goodness. No, I do not know this.
Brenda Howard. She's a bisexual woman. While the first Pride Parade may have been held in Chicago, the mantle of, quote, Mother of Pride belongs to a lifelong New Yorker, Brenda Howard. A Bronx-born bisexual woman, she organized the Christopher Street Liberation Day March and is hailed as one of the 20th century's leading voices in bisexual rights and equality.
Cool.
Yeah. Who was the first sitting president to officially recognize Pride Month?
Oh, wow. I'm going to say Obama.
Actually, no. Bill Clinton. On June 11th, 1999, President Bill Clinton issued Proclamation Number 7203. It was the first time a U.S. president had officially recognized June as Gay and Lesbian Pride Month. On the other hand, asterisk.
And here we go.
Also established the odious "Don't Ask, Don't Tell"
gonna
policy
say.
in 1994, which prohibited openly LGBTQ people from serving in the military. So, I mean, there is that.
There is that.
After that, President George W. Bush did not recognize Pride Month. President Barack Obama, however, followed Clinton's example, marking Pride Month and expanding it to include bisexual and transgender Americans every year he was in office. President Donald Trump did tweet.
He did.
I mean, which in his language, that's an official proclamation, right?
That is his love language.
Okay, that is his
or
love
his hate
language.
language, whatever you want to
Well,
say.
there you go. But he tweeted about Pride Month in June of 2019, but never officially recognized it. And then on June 1st, 2021, President Joe Biden's administration issued a proclamation recognizing June as Pride Month. So that's a little presidential history. So we're tying the civics in here too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you mentioned just kind of how the presidents have recognized Pride Month. But I'll never, ever forget, as long as I live, the day that same-sex marriage was, the Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional, and the White House lit up in rainbow colors. I mean, it was just, people came and just celebrated. It was just such a cool day.
I actually took out a question about that particular date because I felt like we might go a little long, but I agree. And if you haven't read Michelle Obama's memoir about her time in the White House, that story of that day and her and one of the girls trying to escape the White House to go see the colors was, I mean, I've got chills just thinking about it. It was just a fun little behind the scenes story about just the juxtaposition of their situation and that they were having a hard time even getting outside to see it, but it was beautiful. Yeah. Anyways, okay. So last question.
I have not been doing very well on these quizzes today.
You haven't. I'm just going to say, no, it's fine. It's all in good fun. We don't, this assignment is not for a grade. I'm having to channel my inner high schooler. This assignment is not for a grade. Okay. So who hosted the world's largest Pride Parade?
The world's largest.
The world's largest Pride Parade.
London or France?
No, but kudos to you for going outside of the United States.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just assume. I mean, because sexuality has been a lot more freer in other countries, in some other countries.
Wait, you got to stop. Okay, this may not be for a grade, but the grammarian in me is really going to fixate on the last statement you made.
Which was?
I've forgotten it now.
I said because other countries have been more free with their sexuality.
Did you say more freer? Probably.
I probably did that.
You probably did.
Okay, sorry about that, all you grammarians out there.
That's right. Okay, so the world's largest Pride Parade was held in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
You know, I almost said Brazil.
Did you really?
I really did, because I was thinking, I mean, lots and lots of people, they celebrate big down there in Brazil. But then I was thinking, well, lately they've gotten a little bit more conservative. So at any rate, a lot of things
also,
going on.
I probably butchered the pronunciation of that.
No, that's good. That's right.
I feel like I need to add that disclaimer. So it began with a modest 2,000 spectators in 1997, but has since grown to millions.
Awesome.
The Guinness Book of World Records ranked Sao Paulo's parade as the largest gay pride parade celebration in the world in 2006, with 2.5 million attendees, and it has not been beaten since.
Kudos to them.
So, but not to leave out the good old USA, other leading pride parades aren't far behind, with approximately 2 million participants in New York and 1.7 in San Francisco.
Awesome.
So I thought the pride quiz was way more fun than the debt ceiling quiz. However, I also understand that the debt ceiling is somehow important to us.
Well, if we don't want calamity to happen, as you suggested in the quiz, they need to get this deal done. It looks like it's going to happen over the weekend. It's gotten through the House, which was an ordeal. Now it's on to the Senate. Both Schumer and McConnell want to expedite it, get it to the president's desk, hopefully by Monday, because if it's not signed by Monday, we're out of money and the world ends. But no pressure.
No pressure at all. But dang it, they got to work over the weekend.
Oh, poor Congress.
It stinks. They are going to miss all the pride parades.
That's exactly right. So speaking of pride, and I know we need to get to our interview, but at goodfaithmedia.org this month, during Pride Month, we are running a series from different authors talking about inclusion and equality and pride. It's a great series that our listeners are going to want to stay tuned for, because it really is going to be cool.
Absolutely.
Well, stay tuned. Missy and I sat down with Andy Watts.
Have the last few years shifted your faith? I'm Brett Harris, and last year I walked away from the pulpit without a plan. I just knew where I wasn't where I was supposed to be. And I'd love for you to join me as I wander and wonder about faith and Scripture and how we can continue to follow Jesus' example even when our path forward is unclear. Find God Knows Where today in your favorite podcast app.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a special guest with us. Andy Watts is a professor of religion at Belmont University and teaches undergraduate courses in religion and social ethics, also serving as the field education advisor for the college. He has 13 years of experience teaching college-level courses in Tennessee prisons. He is a member of the SALT, School for Alternative Learning and Transformation program in Nashville, which collaborates with the incarcerated students to bring transformative justice and conflict transformation skills inside the prison walls while transforming the practice of punishment in U.S. society. Andy engages Belmont students in experiential learning through his work with SALT and on study away programs through relationships with tribal members on reservations. He has been published in academic and popular resources on these activities. He is ordained at Highland Baptist Church in Louisville and has served as a board member and moderator for the Tennessee Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. Andy, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you, Mitch. It's really good to be here.
Andy, we brought you here today to talk about a very riveting subject, that of the debt ceiling. And as it has been well documented on this podcast, I didn't pay super great attention in civics class in high school. So we're going to start this conversation before my first official question. And we're going to go and we're going to pretend I have a civics quiz next period. You're sitting next to me and I haven't studied. And I say, Andy, help me out. What do I need to know to pass this quiz? Tell me about the debt ceiling.
The debt ceiling, that's a great question. So the debt ceiling, this is a process by which the government needs to pay its debts, which hit a threshold during the Civil War in the 1800s. And so soon after that, the 14th Amendment says we need to pay our debts. And that's how we got credit across European countries' opinions to receive some funding for the war during the Civil War. At least the Union states did. So since then, this has been a priority to recognize U.S. debt. Now, I must just say to you real fast, I do have an undergraduate degree in political science, but I am a religion teacher. I am a theologian and a theological ethicist. And so I'm speaking outside of my field of expertise, but I am an armchair political theorist and an armchair economist. I like to dabble in that. The debt ceiling is important, I think, because it does, as I said in my article in 2011, it helps fund or provide funding for the complex avenues that of resources that it takes to run the kind of democracy that the United States is.
I was going to say, that's a great segue into my question, which I think you're about to answer anyways, but back in 2011, you wrote an article you just referenced for ethicsdaily.com that we republished this last week on goodfaithmedia.org, addressing the debt ceiling standoff between then President Barack Obama and House Speaker John Boehner. You wrote a couple of quotes in the article that I want to address today. The first one is take the current debt ceiling battle. We shouldn't be fooled into thinking it's simply a fiscal debate. So what is the real issue in the debt ceiling debate? It's about the debt of thoroughly democratic governance. And the next statement you made was what we are witnessing in Congress is not a fear of too much debt, but too much democracy. Talk to me about those statements and kind of expand on those a little bit, where those two fields intersect.
Thank you for asking that question, because that's something that I think really connects well with somebody who has an expertise in biblical scholarship or in social ethics based on biblical principles or interpretation of the Bible. I think it's really interesting that this year's debt crisis comes 3 years after the pandemic began, and the 2011 contract with America came 3 years after the Great Recession, and that the 1996 reorganization by Bill Clinton, replacing AFDC with TAMP, came right after the economic mini recession under Reagan, and also, Bill Clinton's ascendancy to the presidency. So there were some insecurities that I think led to these kinds of conservative battles using this one very potent tool, the funding the United States debt, providing enough monies for that. And I don't think it's about money in particular. I think it is about what kind of democracy some citizens want to have, especially those citizens on the right. And I talked about insecure citizenries in that article. And when insecurity sets in, I think that people circle the wagons because they feel like they're either threatened or they're losing power. And now it's even intensified by MAGA in the same way it was intensified by the Tea Party in 2011, and then the contract with America under Newt Gingrich in 1994 through 96. So I think you have this change, and I think this idea of cultural wars is just one expression of the fear that's arising from these changes, these kind of momentous, maybe I don't think they're as momentous as some people think they are, but these momentous challenges to what the United States looks like as democracy.
So, Andy, I mean, in your answer there, which I really, really appreciate, your article was specific about the debt ceiling debate back in the Obama presidency. I think it's also an important point to make that these are expenses that the federal government have already. They've already succumbed to these expenses. This is just paying what we've already done. This isn't future spending. This is past spending that we're talking about. And so, talking about the democratic process, about democracy and insecurities, is there any difference between the debate during the Obama presidency and the Biden presidency? You mentioned MAGA and how it's been ramped up, but are there any other differences? And if it is primarily the rise of this extreme right in the Republican Party, why do you think, what is their goal at this point?
And that's another interesting question. I don't know if I'm an expert or enough of an expert in studying the political culture that's causing what I think you just identified, a new trend in this. I do think it's interesting that in the New Testament, and to kind of go back to my biblical roots here, in the New Testament, as the church grew on from the life of the Apostle Paul and kind of its original beginnings, and it started to face several hundred years later some challenges from the Roman Empire, or at least the citizenry of that, the challenges the Christians presented to culture, they started to become more conservative. We see that in the writings of Timothy and those other texts. And I think that fear is part of this fear of this cultural shift that's occurring right now, as it's kind of has a crescendo, it seems, in the minds of people on the far right, especially the MAGA people. I don't know if I'm right about that. But what I think is happening, and we see this with the Supreme Court too, there is a vigilant effort to make impotent the federal government, to put the economic and political power in state governments. And this has been a promise of the Conservative Party for 30 years now to do this. And I think you see this coming to ascendancy, not only with the Supreme Court decisions and its behaviors, but also with this kind of MAGA challenge to the national debt compared to the Tea Party's challenge. The Tea Party was at least willing to play with the politics of federalism. I don't think MAGAs are. I think they want to dismiss it. I think they don't want to reform it for their liking. I think they want to remove it, erase it.
And I think that is a good point, because you hear a lot of the politicians who would fall in the MAGA camp talk about it seems okay to them if we default on our debt. And that is what is so confusing, because you hear conservative Republicans who are fiscally conservative talk about the danger of that kind of rhetoric and allowing us to default on our debt, what that's going to cause, or what that would cause to our economy overall. But they just seem to want to burn it down. And that's their goal, it seems to be.
I was just reading a quote, I think on NPR article that I read today, about one of the majority of the Republican caucus in House of Representatives. He said, and I don't remember which one it was, he said, I'm a politician and a problem solver, and I'm going to vote for this bill because it's my problem solver self overcoming my politician instincts here as a Republican. And I think that's where you see this divide between the majority in the Republican Party in the House. They want to be problem solvers working with the governmental instruments that we have. And then you have the Freedom Caucus who's saying, no, burn it to the ground, in effect.
Yeah. And you mentioned it a moment ago, and I think this is something of a driving force. There are some theological underpinnings to this type of attitude. And, you talked in your article about the importance of democracy, and democracy, as far as governance is concerned, has a theology of equity within it, that everyone is made equal, by their creator and in the eyes of their creator. But it seems as though those who are in opposition to policies like this have kind of this dominionism that permeates their theology, that there needs to be a ruling class and they are it, and everybody else just needs to follow along and go along with the or with what they would say, not necessarily the majority, but the ruling class. That seems to once again be at play. I mean, this seems to be a debate that this country has always had, of a ruling class versus everyone else.
Yes. And as you mentioned in your introduction of me, when I work with folks inside the prisons, or I work with tribal members on reservations, they always remind me that inherent in the documents of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is language that supports that kind of dominionist kind of perspective of what the United States should be. And that's why I think, just as a side note, talking about originalist language in the Supreme Court, or sticking to the literal intentions of the founders of these documents, that can be dangerous without context. James Samuel Logan, in his book Good Punishment, talks about the need in the United States, in the context of mass incarceration, of creating those who are in, by Christians, by the way, those who are in and those who are out. And this follows a long tradition in Christian theological thought of this, going back to Thomas Aquinas, of labeling folks who are damned in order to ensure that there are people who are saved. And so I think this conservative mindset that we see is kind of like the one we saw in 2 Thessalonians, where you have that little verse that says, if you don't work, you won't eat. And the important thing to recognize, I think, about that is that comment by the author wasn't talking about the poor. It was talking about the wealthy, those who don't do anything, but they are busybodies, and they want to comment expertly on all the affairs of the church without contributing anything. The poor have always worked, but we have this class divide here in times of urgency. I think that the labeling and the ostracizing and the exclusion of these folks by those who are in power is even more pronounced. And I think you see that now. There's a blame game that goes on. It's blaming immigrants or blaming the welfare queen that we saw in Chicago back in the 1990s. And the policy then that we see in this bill, especially with raising the age limit for those in the TAMP funds, raising that age limit for to receive assistance, that working limit, that's more punishment on the poor. It's more, I think, dominionist perspective and activity.
Thank you for that answer.
That is such an interesting point you make about the verse about you don't work, you don't eat. I have not heard that kind of flipped upside down, but that is a completely new perspective on that particular passage. I appreciate that. But in light of that, and kind of going back to your statement earlier about what we are witnessing in Congress is not a fear of too much debt, but too much democracy. You did such a great job in the article of explaining kind of what that meant and how people of faith should frame thoughts and actions in matters of democracy and as it pertains to the debt ceiling. So as we kind of go into more of these conversations going forward, talk to us about people of faith, how we frame our mind's eye around these conversations, and how do we approach these policies going forward?
That's a good question. A lot of people of the Christian faith don't believe that Christians should actually bring their values into the political arena and have them influence the way we think about policy. And then we have those who say that they're only their version of their principles and their faith should form and shape our policies. I think it's very interesting that in the Baptist tradition, and I'm speaking about my own tradition here, there's a document that has 3 iterations. That's the Baptist Faith and Message Statement. And I think it's really interesting that in the 1963 version of that statement, in the definition of the church, the word democratic was inserted into the definition of the church. It didn't occur in the 1920s version, but it continued after the 1960s. And what was going on in the 1960s was democratic upheavals in Africa and in nations that have been colonized, and in the United States as well. So culture affects what Christians believe and how they practice their beliefs. And that's why I think that there is an anti-democratic strain in what's going on with this debt ceiling fight. And I say that because I think that when we think about democracy, we're talking about the enfranchisement of every single citizen and the refusal to exclude those just because they don't participate in some ways that we think, from our faith perspective, should be normalized, perhaps. Matthew Desmond's new book, Poverty, Buy America, is a fantastic analysis of the idea that being a working member of society, being an American citizen, living in a low-income status, or being part of communities that are deprived of resources is so complex we can't even identify with one simple judgment or analysis what's going on there. So we shouldn't make policy that targets one feature of what we think is the problem from a privileged perspective, how problematic that is. Mm-hmm. And so from a faith perspective, I think the Old Testament ethic of the flourishing of the entire community at all times, and that justice starts with the flourishing of the community as well as the individual, but inside of the community, needs to guide our policy making. We need to get back to, as people of the Christian faith, this understanding that the community is the center, not the individual.
Wow. And that is such another great segue into my question, because it seems as though, if we're really honest with ourselves, unrestricted capitalism is our true religion here in America, that usurps Christianity in general. That being said, Do you think there is potential for us to return to this community-centered ideology? Because even capitalism itself is really, in my opinion, bad economics, because it does set into place survival of the elite, or those taking it. It rewards those who are able to take advantage or play the system better, or have better advantages over others. But could we get into a capitalism? Because I don't think we're ever going to get away from a capitalistic society. But could we get to a point where we realize that when community thrives, we all thrive?
That's again, not speaking as an economist, but
Right.
I think it's very interesting that what we see here are also really strong attempts to unravel the New Deal. We see this attempt by neoliberal economic dogma to undo what FDR helped put in place, and acted in some ways as a democratic socialist way of envisioning a safety net. Mm-hmm. It didn't go far enough, I don't think, in my view. But capitalism does, from my perspective, capitalism's values of scarcity, utility, and competition, those three, and we always talk about the Church of Walmart, right? Those three things as the intrinsic values of capitalism, which says it's value neutral, so that it ignores those, just opportunistically. Mm-hmm. Those things are values that I think people of faith need to resist as fundamental values. Of course, they appear in our daily lives in different ways, and they can be very good things. Recognizing those three values, but as fundamental values for what human nature is, I think that's erroneous, and we need to deal with that. But unfortunately, we've conflated Christianity, the gospel, and Adam Smith's invisible hand to such a point where it's never going away, I think.
Yeah. And that's always what's amazed me about, especially Christians advocating for all of these cuts, especially when they're geared towards the poor, the unhoused, minority groups in this country, that they seem to just set aside a lot of Jesus' teachings, just totally ignore them. And in place, all of a sudden they come these unrestricted capitalists, and like, this part of my Christianity, I'm just going to lock away and put away. But now I'm going to focus in on what really matters to me, and that is keeping
I just
my
like
stature.
To bring that flipping tables Jesus in every now and again for good measure.
Right. Yeah.
That's absolutely true. Well, Andy, you have enlightened us. I really appreciate your time with us today on Good Faith Weekly. But before we let you go, Missy's got one last question for you.
Well, Andy, as you know,
Okay.
our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of our conversation today and the work that you do, what is your more to tell?
That's a great question. And I would say volumes, but I listen to, from my armchair where I think that I'm an expert in politics, I listen to pundits, and I don't think, from my perspective, that the threats to the structures, the institutions of democracy that appear to be swirling right now, they're not as imminently dangerous as people think they are. And so the more to tell is that by strong activism and strong advocacy at local levels, for instance, here in Nashville, where I'm just going to mention this, Tennessee had the highest level of unused TAMP funds in 2020 than any other state, and the 9th highest level of child poverty. We cannot lose hope in the strength of activists organizing and advocacy at the local level, despite all of the national things that are going on. All those things are right. But at the local level, I think people of faith need to pay attention to the neighbor and to the institutions and structures that are affecting our local communities, because that's where we live and breathe and where we take care of each other.
Amen. I couldn't have said it any better. So, Andy, thank you so much for being with us. Andy Watts is a professor of religion at Belmont University, and you can find out more on their website. And, Andy, we need you to send us some more great interns like you've done in the past.
Yes, I have some, I think.
Good.
Absolutely. And go check out goodfaithmedia.org for Andy's look back article. It was so well done and such a great, unfortunately, now timely again.
Yes, again.
12 years later, article.
And it will be timely again in 2025 when we have this debate once again.
Absolutely. So go take a look at that article. Thank you, Andy.
Mitch and Missy, thank you.
Andy inspired me to do something I haven't done in such a very long time.
Oh, really?
Yes.
What's that?
I went to the bookshelf to grab a Bible.
Of course, instead of flipping through your phone, as
I was
you
going to
often
say,
do on a daily
might
basis.
assume that means I don't read the Bible. And while to some degree that might be accurate in terms of frequency, I did actually go get a Bible.
Okay. So what'd you find in that Bible besides dust?
Right. I was thinking about the verse that he mentioned in 2 Thessalonians about work. And I just thought, I want to go see this because it's another example of something that was taught, in our church context growing up. I spent my formative years in church in the 80s.
Oh, okay.
In Texas, you can imagine, which, I mean, that space holds, some warm and fuzzy memories, but also, trying to reconcile that and deconstruct some of the things that maybe weren't things I should hold on to. So, folks, we're going to have some Bible study today.
Oh, swords at the ready.
You up for that? Okay, so I'm going to read 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10 from what version is this?
That's the NRSV.
NRSV. It says, "For even when we were with you, we gave you this command. Anyone unwilling to work should not eat."
Well, that seems pretty clear to me.
That'll preach, Mitch. I mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I should have said, sorry, this is from 2 Thessalonians.
2 Thessalonians, that's right.
So I wanted to...
So tell me, down in Texas in the 1980s, what did you hear about that particular verse in the Bible?
That particular verse was equated to President Reagan's kind of his campaign, mantra about the welfare queen. Mm-hmm. And you and I recently listened to a podcast about that, kind of unpacking and telling the truth, of this woman who, he was speaking about specifically, but it just became a general term.
Sure.
I remember it being spoken in my circles. I remember talking about that. I remember, hearing from church pulpits and Bible studies this verse. Well, if you're not willing to work, then you shouldn't eat. And you think, oh, okay, well, sure, that makes sense. We read little children's books about it.
Right.
But then when Andy was talking and said, no, that's not who that was directed to.
Right.
And so I wondered if you would talk a little bit, just as a reminder to our audience, or as a reminder to me, about this book that we call the Bible, that we hold, in as the word inspired by God. Talk to it, even this particular passage or this particular book, as what it is. It's a letter.
Sure. Yeah, and it's one of the very first letters that biblical scholars claim to be some of the oldest words of the first century church, even predating the Gospels themselves. So it's a very important letter, both 1 Thessalonians and 2
Thessalonians. So you're saying they predate the Gospels, because
Yes.
we want to believe the Bible is written chronologically.
Correct.
It is not.
No, it is not. And so this is some of the earliest writings that we have from that first century church. And in this particular case, it is from the Apostle Paul writing a letter, in this case, a second letter to the church at Thessalonica. Now, what we know about Thessalonica is that it was a port city. It also had 2 main routes coming into it. This was a Roman-occupied city, so as you can imagine, there was a lot of trade that took place. It was a very wealthy town, both on the port as well as these roads traveling in. So, very wealthy town. Paul and Silas are there during their second missionary journey, as we find out in Acts. And it is there in Thessalonica that Paul and his entourage work very hard, and he says this in the letter itself, and win people to follow the way, as it was called, the way of Jesus. What we know about this is that a lot of scholars assume that these were Jewish converts, but the reality is they were probably Gentile converts from the language in these letters, because Paul specifically mentions that they were idol worshipers, which means they were most likely Gentiles, not Jews. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, then these are probably the core element of this church is probably pretty wealthy. Mm-hmm. Kind of upper crust of this particular region. This is also a case, Missy, when we read the Bible, we need to read it in its totality, and we need to put it in its context. Because in this verse in particular, we do read that if you don't work, you should not eat. But what does the following verse say?
Would you like me to read the next
Yes.
comment in the comment thread
Please do.
of the Biblical Times social media equivalent? Okay, so verse 11 says, "For we hear that some of you are living in idleness, mere busybodies, not doing any work."
So this, again, is written to the church. Has nothing to do with their professional life, their career life, whatever they're doing. This is happening in the church. Mm-hmm. And what we know about some of these first century churches, especially in Thessalonica, that there was a social order that began to emerge, and they were having a difficult time understanding this concept of we are all equal before the Lord. And that there is...
Good thing we got that one figured out.
Yeah, right? Exactly. And so they were positioning themselves for places of honor. They were not getting ready they weren't helping with worship. They weren't helping with the commemoration of the Lord's Supper, but they were always first in line. They always wanted the prominent places. And so when Paul's talking about eating, he's talking about the love feast, he's talking about the Lord's Supper, these important meals that they had together as a community. And what he is saying, if you did not help, then why should you eat? Your faith is just a mere shadow. It's nothing real. And so he's trying to admonish, especially the wealthy and the privileged within the church, that they need to work. They need to be part of the congregation, part of the worship of our Lord, and be a part of the community, and that we're all equal in the eyes of God, especially in the church.
Are you saying it takes a village?
I
That's
am
what I'm
saying-
hearing.
Yeah, I'm saying it takes a village. And then even more so, you cannot take these texts out of context. You have to measure them. And it's so important for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus to measure Paul's words against the teachings and life of Jesus. Jesus was all about empowering the ostracized and the marginalized, the poor, the sick, the stranger, the outsider. Jesus was a proponent and an advocate for those individuals. And his harshest criticism was always leveled against those in power and those who had money and influence.
Right. Well, I appreciate that reminder. I so appreciated what Andy said about that verse. He said he's not talking to the poor or the quote unquote welfare queen. Mm-hmm. He's talking to, like you said, the privileged, the wealthy, who have learned to take advantage of those who are not. So I don't know. I just felt like that was such a light bulb moment for me. It's amazing. I mean, it's not amazing, but you still continue to have those no matter how old you are. I thought it was worth visiting about for a little bit. And I mean, I grabbed a Bible off the bookshelf. So
That's great.
That's always a good day,
I
right?
have one final point before we wrap this up today. This is also another instance where this is the Americanization of the Bible. They flipped it. They flipped those who interpreted and
Flipped the script.
They flipped the script. And that all of a sudden this became about, the poor who don't work and who are on welfare.
Or lazy.
That's lazy.
The big, yeah, you got to remember that word.
That is not what this text is about at all. And Jesus was not about that at all. For some reason in the Western church, we have flipped that and we have equated all of this harsh criticism of laziness and idleness and busybody to the poor. And that is not the case. The case has always been those criticisms are against the wealthy and the powerful and those with influence in this country or in this world. And we must never forget that. So we should let our theology drive our desire to do better for those who are in need. It is not a handout. It is an offering to say, we see you, we recognize you, we know that you need some assistance right now, because every person I have met that would be considered poor in this country, they're hard workers. Some of them, a majority of them are working. The debate that we just had about the debt ceiling and the SNAP funds, a majority of those people are hardworking Americans. They have jobs, but they still cannot meet basic needs.
Right.
This country is at its best when we see the least of these in our country and reach out to them and empower them and help them get back on their feet. We do it in local communities all the time after disasters, after tragedies. We need to be doing this systemically through our national policies and state policies. So that's my soapbox.
Man, we could go on. I could go on this for a long time. We will revisit this.
Absolutely.
Because I have so much more to say, but we will sign off for today and circle back.
Absolutely. Until next week, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.